Part 1, Chapter 3 of Family Happiness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Family Happiness by Leo Tolstoy. Translated by Nathan Haskell Dole. Part 1, Chapter 3. One day, at the time of the grain harvesting, Katya, Sonia and I went out after dinner into the garden, to our favourite seat in the shade of the linden overlooking the ravine, beyond which stretched a view of forests and fields. Sergyei Mikhailitch had not been to see us for 2 days past, and we were expecting him this day, the more confidently because our overseer had said that he promised to go out to the field with him. About 2 o'clock we saw him riding across the field of rye. Katya told the maid to bring some peaches and cherries, of which she was very fond, and then, glancing at me with a smile, ensconced herself comfortably on the bench and was soon dozing. I broke off a crooked branch of the linden that hung down with succulent leaves and juicy bark, which moistened my hand, and, while I fanned Katya, I continued to read, though I constantly stopped to look down the field road along which he would come to us. Sonia, sitting on the root of an old linden tree, was busy making an arbour for her dolls. The day was hot, calm, and sultry. The clouds had gathered and grown black, and ever since morning a thunder shower had been threatening. I was agitated, as always before a thunder shower. But since noon the clouds began to dissipate, the sun came out bright, and only in one quarter of the sky was there low muttered thunder, and one heavy cloud, piling up above the horizon, and blending with the dust over the fields, was occasionally cut by the vivid zigzag of flashes of the lightning darting to earth. It was clear that we at least should escape for this day. All along the road back of the garden we could see the lumbering teams, loaded down with the sheaves, while the empty telyagas hastened out for fresh loads, accompanied by peasants dressed in variegated shirts. The thick dust neither moved off nor settled, but hung in the air, behind the hedges, among the translucent leaves of the trees in the garden. Farther away at the threshing floor were heard voices, the creaking of wheels, and the rustle of the yellow sheaves slowly moving by the fence, and lifted in the air until the stacks before my eyes grew into oval houses, with the outlines of sharp-pointed roofs, and the figures of the peasants swarming about them. Out on the dusty field also the telyagas were moving about, and there also the yellow sheaves could be seen, and the sounds of wheels, of voices, and of songs were borne into my ears. On one side the field became more and more open, with strips of hedge all overgrown with wormwood. Farther toward the right, down in the unsightly half-reaped fields, I could see the bright-coloured dresses of the women, binding the sheaves, bending over and waving their arms, while the encumbered field grew clear, and the symmetrical sheaves were disposed at intervals upon its level surface. Suddenly, as it were, before my very eyes, summer was transformed into autumn. Dust and heat were all about, except in our beloved nook in the garden. On all sides, in this dust and heat, and exposed to the rays of the sun, were the labouring folk, talking and moving about with noise and bustle. But Katya breathed so peacefully under her white cambric kerchief, and was so comfortably curled up on the cool bench, the cherries looked so black, juicy, and tempting on the plate, and our dresses were so fresh and clean, the water in the pitcher gleamed so refreshingly cool in the sun, and I felt so happy. What can I do about it? I asked myself. How am I to blame that I am happy? But how to share my happiness? And how and to whom shall I give all that I am and all my happiness? The sun had already gone behind the crown of the birches in the alley, and the dust was settling down over the field. The atmosphere became clearer and brighter under the slanting rays of the sun. The clouds passed entirely off. Behind the threshing floor, through the trees, 3 new sheaf ricks could be seen, and the peasants were going away from them. The telyagas, with loud creakings, hastened down into the field for the last time. The peasant women, with rakes over their shoulders and sheaf withes in their belt, hurried home with singing songs, but still Sergyei Mikhailitch did not come, although it had been long since I saw him riding down the road. Suddenly his tall form appeared coming along the alley, from which I did not expect him. He had ridden around the ravine. With his face shining with pleasure and taking off his hat, he came up to me with hasty steps. When he saw that Katya was asleep, he bit his lip, shut his eyes, and came up on tiptoe. I instantly perceived that he was in that peculiar state of inexplicable good spirits which I liked so much in him, and which we called wild enthusiasm. He was just like a schoolboy released from his lessons. His whole being, from head to foot, was instinct with satisfaction, happiness, and childlike merriment. "Well, how are you, my young Violet? How is your health? Are you well?" he whispered, coming to me and pressing my hand. "Yes, I'm feeling first-rate," said he, in reply to my inquiry. "I'm 13 years old today. I want to play horse and climb trees." "In wild enthusiasm?" I asked, looking into his laughing eyes and feeling that this wild enthusiasm was contagious. "Yes," said he in reply, winking one eye and trying to look sober. "But why do you keep hitting Katerina Karlovna on the nose?" I was not noticing, while I looked at him and continued to wave the branch, that I had knocked Katya's handkerchief off and was tickling her face with the leaves. I laughed. "But you will insist that she wasn't asleep," said I, in a whisper, as though I were trying not to wake Katya. But that was not the real reason. It was simply because it was pleasant for me to talk in a whisper with him. He moved his lips, imitating me, mimicking me because I spoke so low that it was impossible to hear what I said. Seeing the plate of cherries, he seized it stealthily, went over to Sonia under the linden, and sat down on her dolls. Sonia was angry at first, but he soon made peace with her by devising a game in which he and she were to see which could eat the most cherries. "If you like, I will have some more brought," said I, "or get them yourself." He took the plate, set the dolls on it, and he and I went together to the enclosure. Sonia, laughing, ran after him, tugging at his coat to make him give her back the dolls. He gave them back to her and turned to me in all seriousness. "Now, why aren't you a violet?" he said to me, softly, as though he was still afraid of waking someone. "As soon as I came to you after all the dust and heat and work, I seemed to smell a violet, and not the fragrant violet, but you know, that first variety that is rather dark and smells of melting snows and the lovely things of spring." "Well, but how is the harvest getting along?" I asked, in order to hide the delicious confusion caused by his words. "Splendid. These peasants are splendid wherever you find them. The more I know them, the fonder of them I become." "Yes," said I. "This very day before you came I was looking from the garden at their work, and suddenly I felt so ashamed because they were working and I was sitting there comfortably doing nothing that—" "Don't take this subject lightly," said he, interrupting me. He suddenly grew grave, but looked into my eyes affectionately. "It is sacred. God keep you from making a show of such a thing." "Yes, it is only to you that I say this." "Yes, I know. But how shall we get the cherries?" The enclosure was locked up and no gardener was about. He himself had sent them all off to work. Sonia ran into the house for the key, but he, without waiting for it, climbed up by one corner, lifted the netting and sprang down upon the other side. "Will you have some?" I heard him say from within. "Give me the plate." "No, I want to pick them myself. I will go after the key myself," said I. "Sonia won't find it." But at that very time I had the strongest desire to see what he was doing there, how he looked, how he moved, when he supposed that no one was observing him. Yes, the truth of the matter was that at that time I did not want to lose him from sight for a single moment. I crept round on my tiptoes on the nettles to the other side of the enclosure where it was lower, and, standing on an empty tub so that the wall came just below my breast, I looked over into the shed. I searched the whole interior of the enclosure with its ancient gnarled trees and their wide dentated leaves, under which hung down, heavy and straight, the luscious black cherries. Bending my head under the net, I saw Sergyei Mikhailitch standing under the bough of an old cherry tree. He evidently supposed that I had gone, and that no one saw him. With his hat off and his eyes shut, he was sitting on the crotch of the old tree, and was busy rolling a morsel of cherry gum into a little ball. Suddenly he shrugged his shoulders, opened his eyes, and, muttering something, smiled. The word that he said and his smile was so peculiar that I repented of having played the spy. It seemed to me that he had muttered the word Masha. "It cannot be," I said to myself. "Dearest Masha," he repeated, still more gently and affectionately. But I heard those words distinctly. My heart beat so violently, and such extreme, and as it were forbidden, joy seized me, that I clung fast with both hands to the fence so as not to fall and betray myself. He heard my motion, looked up in alarm, and, suddenly dropping his eyes, reddened, and grew as flushed as a child. He tried to say something to me, but was unable, and his face grew hotter and hotter. He smiled, however, as he looked at me. I smiled in return. His whole face was radiant with pleasure. It was no longer the old uncle flattering and lecturing me. It was a man, neither superior nor inferior to myself, a man who loved and feared me, and whom I also feared and loved. Neither of us spoke, but we looked at each other. But suddenly he frowned, the smile and gleam vanished from his eyes, and his attitude toward me grew cold and paternal again, as though we had been doing something improper, and he had come to his senses and advised me to come to mine. "You would better get down, you will fall and hurt you," said he, "and smooth your hair, you have no idea how you look." Why does he play the hypocrite? Why does he want to hurt my feelings? I asked myself indignantly. And at that minute I was seized by an irresistible desire to once more confuse him and try my power over him. "No, I want to pick them myself," said I, and, grasping a branch that hung conveniently near, I stood up on the wall and got my feet over. He made no attempt to assist me as I leaped down from the wall to the ground. "What foolish things you do!" he exclaimed, reddening again and trying to hide his confusion under the guise of annoyance. "You see, you might have hurt yourself. And how will you get out of here?" He was still more confused than before, but this time his confusion frightened rather than pleased me. It was contagious. I blushed, and, going to a little distance from him, and not knowing what to say, I began to pick cherries, though I had nothing with me to put them into. I reproached myself, I repented, I was afraid, and it seemed to me that I had forever forfeited his good opinion by my rash behaviour. Both of us were silent, and the silence was awkward. Sonia came running with the key and rescued us from this constraint. But it was some time before either of us said a word, and we both addressed our remarks to Sonia. When we returned to Katya, who insisted that she had not been asleep, but had heard everything, I felt more at my ease, and he tried to assume his ordinary patronising fatherly tone. But it was not quite in his power to do so, and he did not deceive me in the least. I had at that moment the liveliest remembrance of a conversation that had taken place a few days before this between us. Katya had been saying how much easier it was for a man to love and express his love than it was for a woman. "A man can say that he loves, but a woman cannot," said she. "But I have an idea that a man should not and cannot say that he loves," said he. "Why so?" I asked. "Because it would always be a lie. What sort of a discovery is it that a man loves? As soon as one says this, a sort of bolt, as it were, is drawn. He becomes a slave, he is in love. As soon as he utters that word, it seems as though some miracle must necessarily take place, some extraordinary phenomenon, as though a broadside of cannon were fired off all at once. It seems to me," he went on to say, "that men who solemnly pronounce the words 'I love' either deceive themselves, or, what is worse, deceive others." "Then how would a woman know that she was loved if she were not to be told?" asked Katya. "I don't know," he replied. "Every man has his own form of speech. But it is a feeling and should be expressed as one. When I read novels I always imagine what an embarrassed-faced Lieutenant Streltsky or Alfred must put on at the moment of saying 'I love thee, Eleonora.' He thinks that there is to be some extraordinary result, but nothing happens to either him or her. They still have the same eyes and the same nose. Everything is the same." Underneath his jesting remark I felt at the time that there was a serious meaning that had reference to me. But Katya was not satisfied to be put down with the heroes of romance. "Always paradoxes," said she. "But now tell me truly, have you never told a woman that you loved her?" "I never have, and I have never yet got down on my knee," said he with a laugh, "and I never shall." "Certainly there is no need now for him to tell me that he loves me," I said to myself, vividly recalling that conversation. "He loves me, and I know it, and all his efforts to appear indifferent do not exceed in throwing dust in my eyes." All that evening he had little to say to me, but in every word that he spoke to Katya or Sonia, his every motion and glance, I detected love, and I was not mistaken. I merely felt annoyed and sorry for him that he should think it necessary to dissimulate and to pretend to be indifferent, when all the time it was so evident, and when it would have been so simple and easy to be happy beyond telling. But how tormented I was by my criminal act of springing down upon him in the cherry enclosure. I had an idea that I had lost his esteem in consequence, and that he was angry with me. After tea I went to the piano, and he joined me. "Play something for me. I have not heard you for a long time," said he, overtaking me in the drawing-room. "I was going to—" "Sergyei Mikhailitch," I exclaimed, suddenly looking him straight in the eye. "You are not vexed with me, are you?" "Why should I be?" he asked. "Because I didn't do as you wanted me to this afternoon," I exclaimed, blushing. He understood me, shook his head and laughed. His look told me he would have scolded, but that he did not feel strong enough for it. "I didn't mean anything by it. We are friends again, aren't we?" said I, taking my seat at the piano. "Why, certainly," said he. The large, high-studded drawing-room was lighted only by 2 candles set on the piano. The rest of the room was in darkness. The clear summer night gleamed in through the open window. All was still. Occasionally Katya's steps were heard as she moved about in the dark reception-room, and Sergyei Mikhailitch's horse, fastened under the window, whinnied and stamped his hoofs on the turf. He sat behind me so that I could not see him, but everywhere, in the half-light that filled the room, in the music, in my own soul, I felt his presence. Every glance, every motion of his, though I could not see them, was manifest in my heart. I played Mozart's Sonata Fantasia, which he had brought to me, and which I had learned under his direction and for his sake. I was not thinking at all of what I was playing, but I must have played it well, and I felt certain that he was satisfied. I was conscious of the delight which he was experiencing, and though I was not looking at him, and he was behind me, I felt the look which he fastened upon me. Quite in spite of myself, while I still continued mechanically to touch the keys, I turned around and glanced at him. His head was outlined against the clear background of the night. He was sitting, with his head resting on his hand, and looking steadily at me with gleaming eyes. I smiled when I saw his look, and stopped playing. He smiled back at me and reproachfully nodded his head at the music, signifying that I should go on. When I finished, the moon, which had already risen high, was shining in and flooding the floor with its silvery light. Katya declared that it was shameful for me to stop playing at the best part of all, and insisted that I was not playing very well, but he maintained that I had never played so well as that evening, and he began to walk up and down through the rooms, from the drawing-room into the dark reception-room and back again, each time looking at me and smiling. And I also smiled. I even felt like laughing, though there was no reason for it. So happy was I at anything that might happen on that day. As soon as he was behind the door and out of sight, I seized Katya, who was near me by the piano, and began to kiss her in the place that I liked best of all, on her plump neck under her chin, As soon as he came back again, I put on a serious face and did my utmost to refrain from smiling. "What has happened to her today?" asked Katya, but he made no reply and merely laughed at me. He knew what had happened to me. "Just see what a beautiful night it is," said he, from the reception room where he was standing in front of the balcony window that opened into the garden. We went to him, and indeed it was such a night as I've never seen since. The full moon hung over the house back of us, so that it was out of sight, and half of the shadow of the roof, of the pillars, and of the awning of the terrace lay foreshortened obliquely, en raccourci, on the sanded footpath and the oval grass plot. All the rest was bright and flooded with moonlight gleaming on the silvery dew. The wide path between the flower beds, across which on one side lay the slanting shadows of the dahlias and their supports, stretched away fresh and cool, and shining with glittering pebbles into the misty distance. Under the trees could be seen the bright glass roof of the orangery, and out of the ravine rose a shadowy vapour. The still clumps of lilacs where the flowers were not as yet in bloom were bathed in moonlight. All the flowers, wet with dew, could be distinguished from one another. Light and shade were so mingled in the alleys that it seemed as though they were not composed of trees and paths, but were transparent houses, rocking and swaying. At the right, in the shadow of the house, all was dark, dim, and weird. But, with all the greater distinctness from contrast in this darkness, the fantastic crest of the poplar seemed to hang strangely suspended near the house, the top all bathed in bright light and ready to soar away far into the calm blue sky. "Come, let us go out," said I. Katya agreed, but told me to get my overshoes. "It is not necessary, Katya," said I. "Here, Sergyei Mikhailitch will give me his arm," just as though that would prevent me from dampening my feet. But at that time all three of us understood my meaning, and it did not seem strange at all. He had never offered me his arm, but now I took it of my own accord, and it did not surprise him in the least. He and I went out together on the terrace. All this world, this sky, this garden, this atmosphere, no longer appeared the same as I had always known them. When I looked along the alley through which we were walking, it seemed to me that we should in a moment be brought to a stop, that yonder the world of the possible would end, and that all this spectacle must continue for ever changeless in its beauty. But still we moved on, and the magic shadow wall of beauty gave way before us and let us pass beyond, where also, so it seemed, were our garden, the trees, the paths, the dry leaves, all so well known. And we were merely walking along the paths, treading on the circlets of light and shadow, and it was merely the dry leaves rustling under our feet and the cool breeze which fanned my face. And this was only he who, as he walked quietly beside me with slow steps, discreetly allowed my hand to rest on his arm, and this was merely Katya, who, shuffling along, followed just behind us, and that could be nothing else than the moon itself in the sky shining down upon us through the motionless branches. But at each step the magic shadow wall seemed to close behind us and before us, and I found it as hard as ever to believe that we might go farther, to believe in the reality of all that surrounded us. "Oh, a frog!" exclaimed Katya. Who said that, and why, I asked myself, and I instantly realized that it was Katya, and that she was afraid of frogs, and I looked to the ground. The little frog hopped up before me and came to a standstill, and his tiny shadow lay along the bright clay walk. "And aren't you afraid of them?" he asked. I glanced at him. One of the lindens of the alley had been cut down, and at that particular place where we were passing his face was brightly illuminated by the moonlight. It was so beautiful and full of happiness. He said, "Aren't you afraid?" But there was a deeper meaning to his words. I heard him say, "I love thee, dear maiden. I love thee, love thee." His glance and his arms said them, and the light and the shadow and the air and everything repeated the same. We made the circuit of the whole garden. Katya went with us, taking short steps and getting out of breath from her exertion. She said that it was time to go back, and I felt sorry for her, poor old soul. Why doesn't she feel the same as we do, I wondered? Why are not all young, all happy, as this night is, and we with it? We returned to the house, but though it was very late, he did not take his leave. Although the cocks were crowing, although everybody in the house was asleep, and his horse kept stamping more and more impatiently and whinnying under the window, Katya did not remind us that it was late, and, as we sat there talking about various trifles, we had no idea that it was already 3 o'clock in the morning. The cocks were beginning to crow for the 3rd time, and there was a faint tinge of dawn in the sky when he went away. He took his departure, as usual, without saying anything out of the ordinary course of things, but I well knew that from henceforth he was mine, and that I should not lose him. As soon as I confessed to myself that I loved him, I told Katya the whole story. She was very glad and very much touched because I told her, but the poor soul was able to get some sleep that night, while I, on the contrary, walked long up and down the terrace and went into the garden, and, while recalling every word, every gesture, I walked along the very same alleys where we had been together. I could not sleep that night, and for the first time in my life I sat up till sunrise and saw the early morning, and never since have I seen such a night and such a morning. But why, I ask myself, why does he not tell me simply that he loves me? Why does he imagine such difficulties? Why does he call himself an old man, when everything is so simple and beautiful? Why does he waste golden time which perhaps can never return again? Let him say, I love. Let him say the words. Let him take my hand in his. Let him press it to his lips and say, I love. All that is necessary is for his face to flush and his eyes to be cast down before me, and then I should tell him all. Or no, not tell him, but rather throw my arms around him and press him to my heart and weep. But suppose I am mistaken and he does not love me? That thought suddenly came into my mind. I was alarmed at the feeling that came over me. God knows where it might lead me. And his confusion and mine also in the cherry enclosure when I sprang down where he was came back to my memory, and I became heavy-hearted, very heavy-hearted. Tears sprang to my eyes. I tried to pray, and a strange feeling of peace and hope came to me. I resolved to fast from this day forth, to partake of the Holy Communion on my birthday, and on that very day to become his betrothed. Why? Wherefore? How could it be brought about? I had not the slightest idea, but from that moment my faith was firm, and I knew that this would be so. It was already perfectly light, and the people were beginning to get up when I went to my room. End of Part 1, Chapter 3.